What happens when the most debated duchess in the world faces one of America's most seasoned journalists on live TV? If you thought Meghan Markle's past interviews stirred drama, you haven't seen anything until she met George Stephanopoulos. What began as a civil exchange quickly escalated into full-blown tension, shocking millions and leaving them to wonder, had Meghan finally encountered someone who could challenge her directly? The early sunlight streamed through the tall glass walls of the Good Morning America studio in New York. The set glowed with its usual warmth, coffee mugs placed neatly, cameras humming quietly, and the Manhattan skyline shining behind a flawless blue sky. Producers, with headsets and clipboards in hand, whispered with excitement backstage. This wasn't just any interview guest. It was Meghan Markle. Wearing a tailored black pantsuit with her hair swept into a sleek bun, Meghan strode confidently onto the stage, her heels tapping sharply on the glossy floor. George Stephanopoulos stood to greet her, offering a handshake and his polished broadcaster's smile. "Meghan, welcome," George said smoothly. "Thanks for being with us this morning." "Of course," Meghan replied, settling into her seat. Her voice was already a touch distant, though she paired it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Happy to be here." George adjusted his tie and flipped through his cards. There was something in his expression, a signal that this would be more than just a soft celebrity interview. "So Meghan," he began, leaning forward, "you've been making headlines for years. From your acting to your royal marriage, stepping away from the monarchy, and now your projects in the US, you've talked a lot about your truth. But here's my first question. Do you believe your truth has ever clashed with the actual truth?" A quiet stir moved through the studio at the bold question. Meghan raised a single brow and let out a brief laugh. "Well," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm, "I think people who live reading headlines and writing tabloid pieces love to throw around the word facts. But my experiences? They belong to me. My truth is mine. And if that unsettles others, that's not my concern." George didn't react, only gave a slight shake of his head, clearly unconvinced. "That's an interesting response," he said coolly, scribbling on his notepad. "And what about the royal family?" he pressed on. "You've described them in past interviews as distant, even harsh. But when asked for names or proof, you've often avoided details. Some would say that's too convenient. Do you take any responsibility for the harm your statements may have caused both to individuals and to the monarchy itself?" Meghan's smile thinned. "Ah," she said, leaning back and crossing her legs. "Here we go. Another journalist trying to balance out racism and emotional neglect like it's a debate topic. Let me simplify this for you, George. It wasn't my duty to defend that institution. It was their duty to defend me. And they didn't." George's stare remained fixed. "But Meghan, you did gain a lot from that institution. The titles, the platform, the worldwide attention. Isn't there a contradiction in benefiting from something you now criticize?" Meghan laughed sharply, her tone nearly mocking. "Oh, George," she said. "That's the usual spin." She wanted the dream but couldn't handle the crown. "If you honestly think my life was some enchanted fantasy, then you haven't been paying attention." The atmosphere on set shifted, becoming more strained. George hovered his pen over his cards before continuing. "And now you're in the US, making documentaries, writing books, hosting podcasts, repeatedly telling your story. Yet you still claim to want privacy. How do you explain that?" Meghan tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing together. "George, I've said this before. Privacy isn't the same as silence. It means I choose what I share, when and how. That's called boundaries. Something the press clearly doesn't understand." There was a long pause. George studied her, then calmly set down his cards. "Fair enough," he said, though his voice hinted at skepticism. "Let's talk about Harry," he said next. But Meghan waved her hand sharply, interrupting. "Actually, let's not," she snapped. "He's been pulled into enough of these conversations. This is about me, right? George lifted a brow, his mouth twitching slightly with irritation. Well, he said evenly, it's about the full story. And Harry is part of that. Harry is my husband, Meghan replied firmly, her tone now sharp. Not your headline. George didn't look away. And yet you've spent recent years making your marriage very public, he said dryly. Meghan's lips tightened into a thin line. And what about your career before Harry? George asked. You were on a somewhat successful cable series. You've said you were proud of that, but now you seem to dismiss that chapter. Do you still value your acting career, or was it just a step towards something bigger? Meghan let out a low, incredulous laugh. You've really done your homework, haven't you? She said, her voice edged with sarcasm. I've always been proud of my work. But people like you just love to diminish it. What did you do before this? Weren't you Clinton's communications guy? And now you sit there throwing judgment at someone who's actually made a difference. The comment was a clear dig. For the first time, George's expression flickered, only for a second. George stayed composed, but his voice was more direct this time. Let me ask that another way, he said evenly. Do you think people are drawn to you because of your achievements, or because of the controversy you've stirred up? Meghan leaned back in her chair, arms folding tightly across her chest. People are interested in me, she said firmly, because I speak truths most are afraid to say. That clearly makes a lot of people, especially journalists like you, very uncomfortable. George didn't speak right away. He sat back slowly, hands clasped in his lap. The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly into a smile. The tension between them was undeniable now. A duchess unwilling to back down. A journalist unmoved by charm. And all of it playing out live in front of millions of viewers. The energy in the room shifted again as they stared each other down. With each new question, the usual softness of morning TV gave way to something sharper, colder, a battle of egos unfolding in real time. And if anyone thought George was about to pull back, they were wrong. He was just getting started, pushing past the polished answers and deeper into the contradictions. Leaning forward now, George ignored his notes. His full focus was on Meghan. Let's go back for a moment, he said, tone calm but intentional. You've said many times you felt unsupported by the royal family. But what about the British public? Many welcomed you warmly in the beginning. Do you think you let them down when you left? Meghan let out a dry, short laugh. George, don't act like the British press speaks for the people. If some were disappointed, it's because they were fed lies every day. I don't owe anyone an apology for leaving a harmful situation. George nodded slightly, though his jaw tensed. Interesting, he said. Because you often present yourself as someone who stands for fairness, empathy, even duty. But some might argue that walking away from a difficult role is the opposite of duty. Meghan tilted her head slightly, her gaze narrowing. So, are you saying I should have stayed in a toxic environment just to meet public expectations? Is that what you tell your daughters? Or is that advice only reserved for women who marry into royalty? The question was cutting, but George didn't flinch. He even smiled a little. What I'd recommend, he replied calmly, is being honest about your choices and their consequences. For a moment, Meghan paused, caught off guard just enough for George to continue. And about those consequences, he said, voice steady. You've claimed you never feel safe returning to the UK. But is that truly how you feel, or have you shaped that idea to fit your overall story? Meghan's hands tensed in her lap. Her lips pressed together. George, she said finally, her voice tight and cold. Unless you've lived through the kind of hate, racism, and pressure I've faced, you don't get to guess how safe I feel. Keep your theories to yourself. The audience murmured quietly at her sharp tone. But George was unfazed. I'm just asking the question, he said smoothly. Because the public deserves to understand, Are we talking about real danger, or is this more about protecting an image of being wronged? Meghan scoffed loudly. My image? She repeated with disbelief. That's rich, coming from a man who built a career spinning stories for politicians. That hit close. George leaned back, arms folded, his eyes narrowing slightly. You're right, he said after a pause. I've worked with politicians. I know how narratives work. Which is exactly why it's fascinating to see someone who says they hate media manipulate it so well. Meghan's cheeks flushed with color. Her voice sharp as glass. Manipulate? You think being attacked daily, watching lies about me go unanswered is control? That's not mastery. That's survival. George lifted an eyebrow. Survival that comes with huge contracts, glossy magazine spreads, and documentaries that always show you as the victim, or the hero. Meghan leaned forward now, her tone icy. So what are you saying? That I used my pain to get ahead? That I made the most out of a horrible situation? If that bothers your journalist's pride, that's not my problem. That's called resilience. George tapped his pen lightly on the table, not looking away. Or, he said in a low, even tone, it's called opportunism. The silence that followed was heavy. Even the cameras seemed to hold still. Meghan's jaw clenched. Her hands gripped the sides of the chair. Careful, George, she said in a low warning. You're starting to sound just like the tabloids you claim to hate. For the first time, George chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. And you, he said quietly, are starting to sound like someone who believes the world revolves around her suffering. Meghan's breath caught, her eyes sharp with fury. That's enough, she said, her voice tense. You don't know me. You have no idea what I've been through. No, George said calmly. But I do know what accountability looks like. And I haven't seen much of it here today. The tension now was unbearable. Even the camera crew had gone still, locked in the moment. Meghan crossed her arms tightly and leaned back with a cold glare. George, unshaken, leaned forward again, his voice cooler than ever. And now, George said, his tone dropping slightly, I'd like to ask about Harry. Meghan's head shot up instantly, her eyes narrowing in warning. Don't, she said firmly. But George went on. You've often said Harry supported you through everything, stood by you no matter what. But some say he seems isolated now, separated from his family, his country. Do you ever feel responsible for that? Meghan's laugh this time was sharp, more of a scoff than anything else. Responsible? Of course. Blame the wife. Blame the woman. Because clearly, Harry's just a puppet, right? As if he's not a grown man who makes his own decisions. That's such a tired, outdated view, George. Very 1950s of you. George didn't look away. He held her gaze for a long moment before replying calmly. I think viewers can decide for themselves who's influencing who. The silence after that was thick and cutting. Meghan's eyes narrowed to slits. You're unbelievable, she whispered with disdain. George simply adjusted his tie, his voice as smooth as ever. And you, Meghan, are exactly who I expected you to be. By now, the sunlight outside the studio was blazing, but inside, the chill between them had only deepened. What was meant to be a cordial discussion had turned into something else entirely, an intense face-off neither was willing to back away from. Just when it seemed like George might have reached his limit, he leaned in again, ready with one final question that would shift the mood even more dramatically. He folded his hands calmly, studying Meghan. You've talked often about how leaving royal life helped you rediscover yourself, your voice, your independence. But looking at the years since, I don't see independence. I see someone who left one spotlight for another. Who walked away from a palace and built another one out of publicity. So I have to ask, are you truly in control, or is the story you've crafted the one that controls you now? Meghan let out a cold laugh, resting her arms on the table and leaning in. That's rich, she said, her voice heavy with sarcasm. Coming from a man whose entire job is retelling other people's lives. Criticizing them while pretending he's above it all. You don't know me, George. You have no idea what it's like when the whole world decides they know who you are. George didn't blink. He simply tilted his head slightly, still watching her with the calm precision that had unsettled countless politicians before. I don't need to know you, he said quietly. I've seen this before. And I know what narcissism looks like, especially when it's wrapped in the language of victimhood. The word landed like a blow. Meghan's eyes widened, and her mouth opened slightly in disbelief. Narcissism? She repeated, her voice slicing through the silence. You have the nerve to sit there and call me a narcissist? Because I spoke out? Because I took control of my story? Because I didn't sit down and shut up? George's gaze remained steady. There was no reaction, just calm, direct words. No. I said that because every time you're questioned, every time someone challenges you, the reaction is always the same. It's outrage. It's blame. It's always someone else who's ignorant, who's cruel, who's racist. But never you. I've yet to hear you say, maybe I could have handled that differently. Or maybe I hurt someone too. That's not strength, Meghan. That's denial. The studio went silent again. Not even the low hum of cameras could be heard. Meghan stared at him, jaw clenched, her breathing quick. The quiet tension felt unbearable, as if the entire room was waiting to see who would move next. You think you're clever, don't you? She said finally, her voice low and shaking with fury. You think this is some grand moment where you've exposed me? But all you've done is show why women like me stop talking. Why we smile, while men like you tried to rip us apart on live TV. George shook his head, calm as ever. This isn't about tearing you apart, he said. This is journalism. This is asking the questions no one else is willing to ask. Because they're afraid they'll be called sexist, or racist, or cruel. But someone has to ask. The public deserves more than a polished PR version of your story. They deserve the whole truth. And from what I've seen today, he nodded toward her slightly. You don't seem to have it. That was it. Meghan had enough. She pushed her chair back hard, the screech of metal echoing across the floor. I don't have to sit here and take this, she snapped. I'm not going to sit here and be attacked by someone who clearly walked in with an agenda. George's voice was calm, almost soft. It's not an attack. It's accountability. Something no one else has asked of you. Standing tall now, Meghan straightened her suit, her face flushed with frustration. This was a mistake, she muttered. I thought I was coming here for a real conversation. Instead, I got another man trying to twist my story to fit his version of the truth. George didn't react. He sat there unmoved. No, he said simply. This was a real conversation. You just didn't like how it turned out. Meghan clenched her fists, her face tight with emotion. For a moment, it looked like she might say more, something biting and final. But instead, she shook her head sharply, turned, and walked off stage without another word. The sound of her heels echoed down the hall as the cameras stayed still. George remained seated, staring straight ahead. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He let the weight of the moment hang in the air. As Meghan disappeared off set, the studio remained frozen. George sat silently for a long moment, letting the intensity of what had just unfolded settle around him. Then, slowly, he turned to the camera, his voice quiet but composed. To our viewers, he said, I apologize for the sudden end to this interview. But I think it's important that you see these conversations for what they truly are, not just controlled PR moments, but real attempts at truth. And sometimes, truth isn't comfortable. He paused, straightened his notes, and looked directly into the camera. In fact, sometimes it's most important when it is uncomfortable. The studio was thick with silence. Not just from the fallout of Meghan's exit, but from the collective realization that something rare had just happened on live television. She was gone, but her words, and George's questions, lingered in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. As George turned back to the lens, he wasn't done yet. One final statement was coming, one that would ignite headlines and send Meghan's team scrambling to contain the damage. For a while, he just sat there, his pen forgotten on the desk, his note cards untouched. The hum of the cameras and whispers from the crew now felt almost overwhelming in the wake of her exit. Finally, he exhaled slowly, straightened his tie, and began to speak, not to Meghan anymore, but to the millions watching from home. "This isn't how I expected this morning to go," he said, voice steady and measured. "But often the best journalism happens when things don't go according to script. That's when the truth has a chance to slip out." He paused again, letting the words rest for a moment before continuing. The camera tightened its focus, framing his expression of quiet resolve. What you witnessed here was not an attack. It wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was journalism. Holding someone accountable who has shared her story repeatedly on the world's biggest platforms. And just like anyone else who commands influence and attention, she should be held to the same standard. He leaned back slightly, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, maybe it should. Behind the scenes, producers were already motioning to wrap it up. They whispered about sponsors, the next segment, and sticking to the schedule. But George wasn't ready to move on. He kept his eyes locked on the lens, his tone becoming more firm with each word. "There is a line," he said, "between being a victim and building an entire identity around victimhood. Between seeking justice and seeking attention. And unfortunately, that line is starting to blur. Not just in this case, but everywhere." Then his voice softened slightly, just enough to shift the tone. "Let me be clear," he added. "No one is denying that Meghan has faced challenges. No one is saying racism, cruelty, or intense media scrutiny don't exist. They do. And they can hurt deeply. But what we cannot allow," he continued, "is for those truths to become shields against any and all criticism. That's not how accountability works. That's not how trust is earned. And it's certainly not how healing happens." By this point, social media had already exploded. Hashtags were trending. Clips of the confrontation were circulating everywhere, some celebrating George's boldness, others accusing him of being too aggressive. The phone lines in the studio were ringing off the hook. Viewers were split. Half called him a hero. The other half called him a bully. George gave a brief glance to his notes, then deliberately pushed them aside. "I've interviewed presidents," he said. "World leaders. CEOs. Generals. And what I've learned is this: power doesn't always come in the form of money or armies. Sometimes power comes from a narrative. From a story that people are afraid to question." He leaned forward again, folding his hands neatly on the desk. "But my job isn't to avoid those questions. It's to ask them anyway." He let those words hang for a beat before finishing. "I truly hope Meghan Markle finds the peace she's searching for. I do. But today reminded me why this work matters. Because if we stop asking difficult questions, if we stop expecting honesty from public figures, then we all lose." The control room had already queued up the next segment, a cheerful cooking demo with a celebrity chef, but George held up a hand, signaling them to wait. He wasn't quite finished. "And to our viewers," he said, voice quiet but unwavering, "thank you for trusting us to have the hard conversations. They're not always neat. They're not always kind. But they matter." He straightened his notes slowly, gave a small nod toward the camera, then leaned back in his chair. "We'll be right back," he said at last, his voice calm but noticeably tired. The screen faded to commercial, but backstage, chaos had already begun. Meghan had left the building. Staff confirmed she'd skipped the waiting car and stormed down the street with her team following close behind. Her publicist was already crafting a response, likely placing blame on the interview tone, George's questioning, or the network itself. Inside the control room, producers watched a flood of live reactions pour in. Emails, tweets, phone calls, all arriving at once. And as expected, public opinion was sharply divided. Some viewers called George a champion of real journalism. Others accused him of ambushing Meghan, saying he'd gone too far. Back on set, George removed his earpiece and ran a hand across his face before rising from his seat. A producer approached him gently, concern in her expression. "You okay?" she asked quietly. He gave her a small smirk. "I've been better," he admitted. "But I've also been worse." He gathered his papers, straightened his jacket, and left the stage without saying more. As he walked through the studio doors, his phone vibrated again and again, messages from journalists, pundits, colleagues, everyone weighing in. But George didn't react. Not yet. Not until he'd watched the footage himself and decided whether he had asked the right questions, or pushed too far. Outside, the New York morning was brilliant. He slid on his sunglasses and stepped into the light. In that moment, George Stephanopoulos was many things: respected anchor, controversial interviewer, subject of both praise and anger. But above all, he was steady. He was unshaken. And so we're left with the question, what did you think of this unforgettable interview? Did George cross a line, or did he simply do what others were unwilling to? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more moments where the truth refuses to play nice.